Tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. A seed planted today takes root and grows into a tree that bears fruit in the future. Over 110 years ago, a seed was planted. Today, that seed, the idea of excellence, has grown into the University of Pretoria, South Africa's largest contact research-intensive university. 9 faculties and a business school are spread across 7 beautiful campuses, which are home to over 50,000 students, ready to make an impact in the world beyond university and join our global network of nearly 300,000 alumni. Future-focused, sustainably developed facilities and cutting-edge multi- and transdisciplinary research are underpinned by a desire to transform lives and have a positive impact on communities and the world. Excellence in teaching, learning, research innovation, arts and culture, and sports puts us firmly amongst the world's best universities. Knowledge is not just what is in books. It is the wisdom to apply it, to nourish and nurture the seed so that it takes root, grows tall, bears fruit, and branches out. UP plants that seed, that tiny bit of curiosity, creativity, critical thinking, hope, the desire to care, respect, help, and innovate against all odds, to grow, to leave your mark, to excel, to challenge the norm, to think, to rethink, to discover, to inquire, to lead, to have courage, to make a difference, and to persevere. This is the University of Pretoria. We make today and every day matter.
Welcome everyone to our second session of our symposium on the scientific and social impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to say good afternoon, but depending on your time zone, is good morning and good evening. In this session, we are going to be discussing the social impact of the pandemic, and we are also going to be focusing on its long-term effects with a focus on civil liberties. We are also going to be looking at food security and sustainability. We are also going to be discussing gender-based violence against women and the vulnerable in our communities. Lastly, we are going to be also discussing the impact of COVID-19 on weaker economies. To join us in these discussions, we have a panel of 4 speakers. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, who is going to be Professor Teboho Moja. Professor Moja is a clinical professor of higher education at New York University, an extraordinary professor at the University of the Western Cape, South Africa. She is also a visiting research fellow at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria here in South Africa. She has published extensively on higher education policy, presented numerous keynote addresses at international conferences on higher education issues. We are also joined by Professor Lindiwe Sibanda, who is a director of the African Research Universities Alliance, ARUA, Center of Excellence in Food Security, hosted at the University of Pretoria in collaboration with the University of Nairobi and the University of Ghana. She's a globally recognized African food systems expert and serves as the co-chair of the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture. She's also a member of the SDG Target by 2020 Champions on reducing food loss and waste. She's also a commissioner of the Eat Lancet Commission on Sustainable Healthy Food Systems. Our third speaker is Professor Frans Swanepoel. He is the Director of Strategic International Partnerships at the University of Pretoria and a professor in Agricultural Transformation Africa at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship Professor Swanepoel is recognized as an expert in agriculture and food systems transformation and capacity development in Africa. His research interest includes smallholder agricultural production systems, agricultural education and training, and agricultural research and innovation leadership in Africa. Our last speaker is going to be Professor John Sharp. Professor John Sharp is an emeritus professor of social anthropology, the project leader of Human Economy Program, and a senior research fellow at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship. He has taught at universities of Cape Town and Stellenbosch before moving to Pretoria in 2001. Lastly, I would like to introduce Professor Ogude with his opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you all. My role in this segment of our discussion is a very short one, and that is really to thank you all for joining us. I hope that some of you managed to attend the first session that I think went extremely well, and I'm hoping that this particular session will also go well. Special thanks really for those of you who are joining us from outside our borders. In particular, I want to thank Professor Tebo Moja, who is joining us all the way from the USA. Prof, thank you very much for accepting to be part of this process, and Professor Lindiwe Sibanda, and obviously those members of our center, Professor John Sharp and Professor Franz Swanepoel, all of whom will take part in the deliberations this afternoon. Finally, our session moderator, Dr. Mushonga, who is a postdoctoral fellow within our center, responsible for the environmental humanities, one of the major projects in the center. She will moderate the session, and I want to thank her for accepting to play this role. And with that, again, welcome to all of you. Thank you.
So once again, I would like to welcome all our speakers, and we're really looking forward to your thoughts and your reflections on the pandemic. And so this is how we are going to proceed. For those that are joining us today, our presenters are going to speak for at least 20 minutes each. And then we are going to use the remaining time of the session for your questions, comments, or reactions. So those of us that are watching us from home, please let's get the chat box buzzing with questions and your reactions, and we are going to visiting the chat box soon after the presenters. So to get straight into it, Professor Moja, would you like to get the ball rolling for us?
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this seminar today, an important seminar, of course. And thanks to technology that I can join you in Pretoria while sitting here in New York or so. So talking about the impact of COVID-19 on education, I thought it's better to start by looking at the context of COVID-19 now, or where we stand today as we speak in terms of the World Health Organization data that has been provided. As of today, we have over 36.5 million cases with over 1 million deaths globally. In Africa, we have over 1 million confirmed cases. And of those 1 million, half or more than 500,000 are actually in South Africa, which is worrisome. And for Africa, we have 27,000 deaths, which has puzzled the scientific world because of the low mortality rate that we're experiencing in Africa. But in South Africa, out of those 27,000, 18,000 deaths are reported to be in South Africa, as reported by Minister Zweli Mkhize yesterday. So for the higher education sector, at the beginning of this month, it was reported that we are standing close to 2,000 reported cases. And I emphasize reported because there might be some that are not reported, with 89 deaths. Low numbers, but they're still significant in terms of people we have lost in the sector. And the breakdown for that is that 69 of them are in the staff category, while 20 are students. So touch wood that our numbers don't go up. So of those affected in the sector, the numbers are good, but we still have to remain vigilant and careful as we reopen the sector. So COVID-19 brought about challenges for us, but with challenges comes opportunities as well. I am reminded of the words of Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago, when he once said, "Never let a serious crisis go to waste. It's an opportunity to do things you could not do before." So as I continue with my talk this morning, I would like to look at the impact in various areas of the higher education sector. I'll try to touch on the challenges as well as some of the opportunities created. And all this is based on observations for now, because we need in-depth study into really getting a real grip of what the impact has been. So with that, we know that COVID-19 is not the last pandemic on earth. Therefore, I ask the question as to how do we prepare for the next pandemic a century from now or less, particularly in the education sector. So looking at South Africa, 2015, hashtag fees must fall, hashtag roads must fall, decolonization calls, disruptions led to the establishment of blended learning systems in some of the South African universities that were most affected. And since then, I've observed blended learning conferences. I've attended some that are hosted by University of Cape Town jointly with Free State University, University of Johannesburg, University of Pretoria. And the private sector has also jumped on that, having seen an opportunity to also host conferences regarding blended learning. So an opportunity was created out of the we had in 2015. These conferences analyze case studies, share best practices in design, do a self-evaluation, explore assessment tools, and many other things. They also share resources such as guidelines for blended learning and an open education resource. So these are some of the opportunities that were created, and we can learn from that. So the lessons learned out of that experience and what has been done since then is that we have a need to invest highly in the technology needed to deliver education remotely. There's a need to focus on academic activities that ensure effective use of blended learning systems. We cannot just take it for granted that once you put your material online, everything will go smoothly. And that we need to keep on letting government know and tech companies know that they need to invest more in infrastructure development. So let me move on to what has been the impact on the sector. In March, when the country shut down, all campus activities stopped abruptly. There were hurried departures back home, including our international students. So From that, institutions had to communicate with all students, but at the same time, not all students could access their messages. All that begs the question as to whether the country was digitally ready for a big move. And in answering that question, I would say not really ready per se. And according to one of the chief economists of the Swiss-based International Institute of Management Development, Christopher Skabolis, who I would like to quote, talking about the state of South Africa. He complimented South Africa on spending a lot on education, but still having some shortcomings. He recently said, and this is a quote now from him, that despite the fact that South Africa ranks first in this category, that's a category of spending on education, among countries on education spending, it scores dismally in other areas, including digital and technological skills, higher education achievement, science graduates, employee training, high-tech patents grants, research and development expenditure, and personnel, and lacks international experience. What happened in South Africa and not being ready with that is that, not ready technologically, is that the pandemic blew off the lid covering vast inequities in society. It brought to the fore the remnants of what still needs to be addressed in the sector, as well as our society post-1994. There is and there was uneven readiness amongst institutions. We have some institutions that still have higher enrollments of students from the lower socioeconomic backgrounds, but have limited resources to address their needs or to offer them affordable quality education. There are in our system inequities among students in accessing remote learning. And with all this, the long-term effects of these disruptions. So these general disruptions and the long-term effect that I want to sort of move to indicate to us how we have got, sorry for that we have, although we have had these disruptions in education, the academic year will still be completed, but the calendar has shifted, and that has its own implications as well. As of 17 September, it was reported that we have 7 institutions that are classified as medium risk. That medium risk because they have large numbers of students not fully engaged in teaching and learning programs as late as mid-September, and that's called medium risk. What does low risk look like? Low risk, we have institutions so far of students that, with students that are participating, but not everybody's participating, but they are at low risk of not completing the academic year. So the academic year had to be adjusted, and institutions have shifted and altered the completion dates. We have so far altered dates that range from 10 institutions that are planning to complete the year by December. We have 4 that are planning to complete in January, 7 completing in February, and 5 as late as March. And that has got implications, obviously, for job searches and other implications. This in itself is a big indicator of the disparities in our higher education sector. The plans for 2021, what do they look like? The plans as released by the ministry are that first-year students will only start their academic year as late as March 8th, or between March 8th and April 12th, due to late matric results, which are anticipated in late February, on the 23rd of February, if all goes well. So there are disruptions in planning overall for students, families, and institutions as well. And with those disruptions, there are major changes or the major impact on access to higher education. We know that we have inequities in our institutions, and with this COVID-19, there will be a perpetuation of those inequities among students, depending on the schools that they are currently attending. This is not a new issue, but has been worsened by the pandemic situation. There is also, in terms of access, a likelihood of a loss of regional and international students, despite borders opening up. And as I draw from the quotation I had earlier on about our readiness, it is mentioned that South Africa is doing badly on international ranking. So we do need those international students, because exposure to international students helps a bit. We know that South African students do not travel that much, and our focus is on internationalization and having them interact with international students. Another impact is that enrollment figures are likely to be impacted for the next academic year due to high failure rates and economic needs of students and their families. Therefore, there will be an impact on finances as well, which might lead to some layoffs in some of the institutions, as it has happened in the US. We have seen some institutions laying off staff or so in order to balance their books. There will be concerns as we open up with returning students. We will be concerned about safety and security in terms of adherence to safety protocols, especially in university residences or even just around universities in general. There will be need for space modifications for safety, with impact on student lives and experiences on campus. We know that part of being at university is to experience life on campus or so, in order to grow and to develop for students. There will be concerns about mental health issues for staff and students, and with mental issues and health issues in particular, looking at what is happening in the US. I looked at a study that was completed by the American Council on Education, which is a body where its members are university leadership, university vice chancellors or so. They conducted a study in September, and one of the main issues of concern raised by the vice chancellors were mental health issues that they will have to deal with. So continuing on the access track, due to the spikes that we've seen in many places in the past, we can anticipate some spikes in South Africa now that the country is operating at level 1, and some of them may be short-term, may lead to short-term disruptions, and this is not something that we can escape. Having just read in this week the 40 students, 30 of them who were infected, or the 89 tin roof matriculants who were infected after partying and doing what young people are likely to do at other institutions as well. So this is something we can anticipate. At the university where I'm based, University of New York, New York University here, when students returned, the first thing they did, despite all protocols put in place, was to get out and party in one of the parks or so. So with all that, with the issues that I raised, we also need to look at what opportunities have been created relating to the impact on access or so. We need to come to terms with the fact that blended learning is a new normal and need to enhance it further, develop it more or so that we are ready. Opportunities have been created for access through flexible learning modes. There are cheaper access opportunities for international students with no travel, engaging them and increasing the number of international students participating in our system. There are opportunities for expansion and increasing participation rates without the need for new builds, therefore addressing the low participation rates we have in the country that we have been struggling with. Another area of impact, I'm conscious of time, is affordability. Affordability will be an issue. Loan burdens that students will be facing with lack of employment prospects for repayments, that would also be an issue that some students might be hesitant to take loans for. We have had high levels of unemployed graduates, but with COVID, those numbers will go higher. Food insecurity and hunger that students are experiencing currently will also be elevated. Lack of digital devices and data to really engage in blended learning will be a problem. For now, with affordability, the ministry has sort of indicated their will to assist. But what I found interesting is that the assistance is not in the form of putting additional resources, but they want to ensure the completion of the academic year by providing directives for affordability for the students and not necessarily for the institutions. They've released a government gazette on October 5th that states that tuition fees paid in 2020 should include additional months of learning that goes into 2021 without charging extra. They have indicated the guidelines or directives that accommodation fees that have already been paid should cover students until March 2021 with no additional charges. So here's an opportunity with affordability to explore how to offer cheaper and accessible options for education without having additional cost. There's impact on teaching and learning, impact on quality education and training. We know that there are pedagogical challenges due to lack of competencies and training in online teaching. We're not ready for that. We need more innovative strategies to enhance the teaching and learning. We need increased support for teaching and learning that in ways that we had not thought of in the past. So there are also some challenges when it comes to disciplines that you cannot offer effectively online. So the opportunity that I identify here is that we'll need to be more creative and reach more students than we had done in the past. There's an opportunity for us to experiment with new tools. There's an opportunity to improve access to other resources in our institutions like libraries, laboratories, also remotely. The last area that I want to touch on is the impact on research. We know that there were abrupt stops of some research projects that might not be completed at all as planned or completed at a later stage. There were cancellations, postponements of scientific conferences to share scientific knowledge. So how do we address that? There have been budget cuts. The Department of Higher Education and Training recently announced the research funding cut at a time that, in my view, is the time that research funding should be increased so that we can research the impact of COVID on all spheres of our society or so. We are challenged to reprioritize without sacrificing other priority areas essential for development, especially the social sciences that have suffered cuts and scaling down in the past. For research, there are also opportunities for collaborative work without travel, opportunities to identify new research areas created by the pandemic, and opportunities to contribute to public policy debates and inform policy based on our research or so. So overall, we need to rethink higher education and its role in society. we needlessly think of how our higher education sector is structured and offered in the country. I have noted efforts that are being made, for example, the rethinking of UNISA that is on the cards at the moment, but other universities need to embark on their own strategizing and rethinking as well. We need to rethink the sharing of resources between institutions and countries. I was pleased to see during the pandemic earlier, when we were at level 5 or so, to see University of Pretoria sharing and using its infrastructure for the University's South Africa meeting during that pandemic period. We need government and telecommunication companies to seriously invest in the improvement of online connectivity also. So moving ahead, there will obviously be need for continuous monitoring of infections. And in that case, who has and who hasn't got resources to do that in the sector? There will be possible spikes, as I mentioned, and perhaps lockdown once more on temporary shutdowns for some institutions or some areas or so, if we are to take the examples of what has happened in other parts of the world. There will be increased mental health issues that I've mentioned, not only in the institutions, but in society at large. The major economic impact on society has also got implications on what we do in higher education. And finally, the lingering incomplete transformation agenda will be back on the agenda. For that, we need a systemic, in-depth study of the impact of COVID so that we can address the issues from both the institutional levels as well as the systemic level. So I will stop here and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Mojo, for your insights on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education, also the opportunities available for rethinking higher education in the COVID era. Professor Sibanda, what has been the story like with food security?
An interesting story. As has been said, any crisis provides an opportunity. And I just want to start by highlighting, slide number 1, that COVID-19 is a human health crisis in as much as it's a health crisis. And anything to do with human health is a food crisis because we all need food. So when we start from there, it's critical that as we are addressing the pandemic, we also look at how we are doing on the food sector. Unfortunately, next slide, we already starting on a bad footing. As we speak, we have a mega challenge of trying to feed 1.7 billion more mouths by 2050. As Africa, we are not producing enough. Globally, there could be enough, but 1/3 of what is produced goes to without reaching the intended beneficiaries. The land that we should be growing food on is declining at a rate of 40 to 55%. And we've all felt, particularly in Southern Africa, this water scarcity challenges that are becoming a challenge. Climate change is affecting all of us. And then there's the disease of malnutrition and stunting. I'm deliberately calling it a disease because when we talk about nutrition issues, we always dismiss them as not being important, but they are leading to diseases. Slide. There are 820 million people who go to bed hungry every day. When the pandemic struck, we already had these 820 million to bed hungry every day. The sad thing is that for Africa, the very people who are supposed to be producing our food, the smallholder subsistence farmers, are constituting 50% of the total number of people who go to bed hungry every day. Then there's the issue of undernutrition in children. 99 million of our children are underweight, and 161 million are stunted. The sad thing with the stunting is that the cognitive capacity of these children is unlikely to be enhanced because they've been stunted, their brain power is underdeveloped. As a result, after 2 years, if there are no interventions, that is an irreparable damage. When we're talking of undernutrition, we are also suffering from a pandemic of overnutrition with 2 billion adults worldwide who are overweight and obese. That means either eating too much, but also maybe lacking some of the micronutrients, the vitamins, and that are required for balanced growth. All these figures point a picture to Africa where really chronic hunger has become a pandemic, and we are really the museum of stunting, of undernutrition, and 40% of our childbearing women are anemic. And you can imagine what that means for the children they are carrying. It's no surprise, therefore, that 33% of childhood deaths in Africa are linked to undernutrition. It's something we can do something about, but we have not done much. And has been said, this crisis should be an opportunity for us to revisit our agriculture sector, to revisit our nutrition matrices, to revisit the net that connects our agriculture, our nutrition, and the health and the economy, because 12%, it is estimated that 12% losses in GDP occur as a result of stunted growth of our children. And it's already been documented now during COVID period that a 1% drop in GDP results in 0.7 million more stunted children. We cannot afford that. What happens and what happened, or is what is happening currently during the crisis? As households are running short of food because of economic challenges, of poor access, they are reverting to eating less. The implications of eating less and poorer quality food are far-reaching than the today that we talk about, particularly for our pregnant mothers, where the in utero growth of the fetus is highly dependent on the food intake. But maybe let's step back and go to the diagram that describes food security and the fundamentals that drive food security. I hope the right slides are showing. We see that in the actual, I think we need to go down to the settles, please. I've gone through the challenges. Yep, here we are. If we go back to the fundamentals, back as 1996, it was observed that we have a challenge. We are not doing well when it comes to availing quality food. And it was agreed at a World UN Summit that food availability entails production, distribution, and exchange of food. It is fundamental to achieving food security. Access for those who are not producing the food means it should be affordable, it should be allocated to meet the dietary requirements and to meet the preferences that the individuals would want. But finally, the utilization of that food, its nutritional value, the social value, and the food safety, it's got to be safe food. Unfortunately, most of the emphasis in 20 years has been on food availability. We have ignored the issues of access, which is why we have Sustainable Development Goal number 1, which is reducing poverty. Most of those people who are poor are going to bed hungry every day. But most important, we have not paid much attention to the nutritional value of food. Food has become a quantity game because it's commoditized and the health component is ignored. Next slide, please. Food is not just about the nutritional value. It is more than agriculture. It is nutrition for the people. It is nutrition for the environment. It also provides income and jobs, but it also provides other byproducts. As we go into agriculture, there are other products that can yield income, but also provide safety nets. But most important, food is a culture. It's a way of exchanging gifts, exchanging love. And I can never put it better than the Vice Chancellor, Professor Cooper, put it in the webinar we had last week, where he went through the whole cycle and he also on what food means to people. We unfortunately have not gone back to those fundamentals to unpack each one of those meanings, particularly in a crisis like COVID, to then identify the appropriate intervention mechanisms that can mitigate against the effects of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So when we go back to our farmers, particularly the smallholder farmers who are currently feeling the brunt of the pandemic, but most important, of the policy interventions that have made, that have restricted either the marketing of the food they produce or the access to inputs or the labor that they need for their farm. We look at 5 capital assets that have been affected. The natural asset, which is the arable fields and the fields where their livestock are grazing, have been affected mainly because of just lack of manpower. Physically, the assets that are needed in the farming households are being affected because of poor maintenance, lack of access of service, particularly during the long lockdown. Human capital. It was said earlier this morning during the webinar that we've had a series of crises, and if we look at the impact of HIV and AIDS, particularly for us in Southern Africa, human capital was heavily knocked, particularly in the smallholder farms and in the commercial farming areas. That calls for a need for mechanization, but more important, for enhancing the health of the people in the farming sectors. The social networks have been affected. We cannot greet, we cannot talk, because food and agriculture has been a way for convening, for sharing knowledge, for extension services to be provided to a group of farmers at the same time. That has been affected by the COVID restrictions that have been put in place. But most important is the financial asset, because people have been laid off work, remittances have declined, particularly for those that rely on remittances from international transactions, but also locally as people are laid off work or are not able to do their regular work. Now, I'm excited because FANAPAN, the Food Agriculture Natural Resources Policy Network, came up with an index, the Household Vulnerability Index, next slide, where they were able to quantify a collective of all assets and what it means. The picture that is depicted there shows you the proportion in any country of households that are vulnerable. We have those that are highly vulnerable and can do very little about their status and have to rely on social safety nets. We have the middle group, and unfortunately, as a result of COVID-19, those who are sitting on the table, on the edge of the table, half of them have fallen off. We have the least vulnerable group, where most of us attending this webinar have been sitting, but none of us can say we are still in the center of the table. We have been impacted, and our 5 capital assets have in some way been affected. This is calling for mobilization of interventions from all sectors to make sure that we keep a rigid framework of support so that no more fall downs happen. We want to keep more people in the middle of that table, and we want to minimize people who fall into the safety net where we will have to provide support. Next slide, please. Now, what does this then mean? We cannot be talking about farmers when we have got urban consumers who cannot produce. We cannot be talking about farmers and consumers, yet there are people in the value chain that are dependent on this sector, but have never been given the space or the scrutiny to say what assets do they have and how they've been impacted. This now leads me to talk about the food systems approach. I was asked to address food security, but food security has limitations because the food sector is affected by many systems. We take it from the production side, which is the fork that you see on the left, to the fork and knife that you see on the right. There are many systems that intertwine and integrate to deliver that food to the table. Next slide, please. If we unpack those, we have production, processing, packaging, transportation, distribution, the food services, cooking and consumption, and then the management of our waste. Every one of those is a cycle that's been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And for us to better understand what's been happening, it's important when we take this food systems approach that we visit each and every one of those systems and understand what is the best intervention that can mitigate the impact of COVID-19. Next slide, please. We are aware that really at the end of the day, what we do in agriculture, what we do for nutrition, what we do for health ends up with a dollar sign. And what's important that we've learned during this pandemic is that healthier bodies, younger bodies have been able to bounce back better. We speak about underlying conditions, and most of those related to malnutrition, diabetes, obesity, and that is why we need to urge our governments to be investing more in nutrition, because the returns, as you can see from that, are humongous. So we need to be preaching agriculture for nutrition, a food systems approach that enhances nutritious diets for a healthy planet and for healthy bodies. Next slide. Now, unfortunately, poverty in most of our African countries, majority are living on less than $1 a day. The rural areas are impacted, but we're seeing a new trend where poverty is pushing more into the urban areas. This is because of increased urbanization, but the whole problem now comes back to who will produce our food, how will it be produced, will it be accessible, will there be jobs, will we conserve our environment? Next slide, please. I spoke about the key challenge. If we look at the pandemic, we are 6-7 months into it. One of the key areas that we need to be worrying about in the health and nutrition nexus and agriculture nexus is those pregnant mothers. 9 months pregnancy and carrying a child up to their second birthday are the critical windows for reducing stunting. We are already doing badly on stunting, and COVID-19 is likely to exacerbate this, particularly for those mothers who were pregnant at the beginning of the onset of the lockdown, had no access to quality food, and they are carrying these babies. What interventions are required in order to reverse timeously the challenge of the looming challenge of stunting that this generation is likely to face? Next slide, please. Where are the research opportunities for bouncing back better post-COVID-19? I think the main thing is let's unpack the food system value chain. Let's look at our soils, our germplasm. Let's look at opportunities for biofortification. Let's not leave out animals in our diet and just focus on crops. Let's have a diversified diet that provides all nutrients. Let's look at technologies that can enhance the retention of nutrients in the food. But also let's look at education of nutrition knowledge, because evidence from statistics and research shows that it's not so much the educated households that do better. They are all doing badly when it comes to nutrition, regardless of income levels and regardless of education. So what that means is that we need to be investing more. Let's look at our policies and let's look at the market enhancements. Next slide, please. Now, the agriculture sector, the food system sector cannot do it alone. We need to be working closely with the health sector. We need to be looking at water and sanitation issues. We need to be looking at education. We need to be talking on the economic and the impact of not doing good and not taking advantage of this crisis to come in with the long overdue interventions that will help us bounce better. But most important, on social protection, I think we need sharper, more targeted, digitalized mechanisms that will identify the vulnerable and be able to target those mitigation strategies that will make them bounce back better and not leave them below the table as dependents. Next. Now, what are the key things in the research that we should be doing? I think we are lacking some integrated metrics that we can talk to as a language between agriculture, between nutrition, between the health sector and the economy, so that we understand the impact of not doing good now and the preparedness we need for future pandemics and future crises. But we also need to take a bottom-up approach. Let's granulate the issues and demystify the science and talk about the basics. What is the health challenge we are dealing with? What is happening at the household level? What assets exist in these households? And what are the people eating, so that we can better understand how our science can help addressing these issues? Clearly, institutions that are solving people problems actively, not in silos. And this is a challenge to each and every one of our universities. COVID has taught us that we are in it together. Gone are the days where food is just for the agriculture sector. We need to open up and find solutions in engineering, in the social sciences, and in the arts, just to make sure that everybody finds space to provide solutions. Next slide, please. We have a wonderful opportunity for doing all this because food relates to all 17 sustainable development goals. If we look at the biosphere, food has a big role to play there. If you look at it, those are the 8 SDGs. If you look at the economy, the 4 top 8, 9, 10, 12 SDGs that relate to that. But most important is finding the partnerships. We don't have to do everything. We have to bring in the right partners for us to address the food challenges that will help us bounce back better. Next slide. There couldn't have been a better opportunity. We've seen the interventions on the trade corridors by our leaders, and we're grateful, particularly for those in the northern countries, because food has been coming in out of South Africa. But we need to look at better tools for protecting the vulnerable, but we need to look at nutrition-sensitive social protection measures. Schools were shut down. It means the school feeding programs were affected. What are we doing to catch up and address the impact? We also have to remember that we are in a climate crisis. Any intervention has to be smart and it has to be green so that we are resilient for future pandemics. But most important, can we rally support and start preparing for the big need of September 2021, the Food Systems Summit? Next slide, where the Secretary of the United Nations is going to be hosting all countries in a summit that's for the first time addressing the issue of hunger in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. We are going to be looking for solutions and not taking our problem. And we need to close the gap between food production, food waste, and the climate challenge that we are facing and come up with sustainable food systems, not just for Africa, but the whole world. My last slide talks about the Africa that I want to see. And it's an Africa that has resilient, sustainable food systems, because I believe this will help us bounce better from any pandemic that we are to face in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sibanda. Wow, 820 people going hungry every day. And for others, the headache is just obesity. Yeah, you know, such is the unevenness of the food security terrain that we live in. We are going to go straight to our third speaker for the interest of time. And our third speaker is Professor Frans Swanepoel.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this conference on the scientific and social impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The previous speaker emphasized the importance of food systems transformation and moving from a food security to a food systems approach. I'm going to focus specifically on food systems transformation, the lessons that we have learned amid this global pandemic. In the next slide, you will see that Professor Lindiwe Sibanda has emphasized in her last slide the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. You will notice that food and agriculture has a central role to play, and I relate it to all 17 of these goals. I think the pandemic has highlighted the interconnectedness of global sustainability challenges and how shocks and interventions in one system have far-reaching impacts on others. It has also reaffirmed the need for a systems approach and systems thinking when we want to solve global challenges and complicated issues such as food systems transformation. One example is the intersection between health and the food system, for example, where interventions in the health system to curb the spread of the disease are having increasing effects on the food system. The pandemic has also exposed the inadequacies in the global food system, but particularly highlighted the glaring inequalities across regions, especially in the developing world, including Africa. These inefficiencies are particularly salient in African food systems, where the pandemic's ripple effects have significantly affected a number of dimensions of the system, also emphasized by Professor Sibanda, but particularly with reference to food supply chains and access to food. The closing of borders and implementation of lockdowns have seen the rather fragile food supply chains in Africa truncated further. Critical inputs, for example, seeds, fertilizer, seeds, are in short supply. With current trade restrictions, agricultural production on the continent could be further contracted, and these disruptions will have a large economic impact in Africa, where farming accounts for approximately 60 to 70% of employment. Furthermore, the lockdowns have inhibited the informal market and the informal trading by limiting access for both producers and consumers. Food insecurity is not a new challenge to Africa. Before the pandemic, as mentioned by Lindiwe also, 1 in 5 Africans faced food insecurity. Undernourishment was very high, and about a third of children under 5 were short for their height. She referred to that specifically in terms of stunting, referring to it even as a disease. The pandemic will certainly worsen this situation. Projections estimate that the pandemic could lead to more than 250 million people suffering from acute hunger before the end of this year. This is more than double the estimated number in the global report on the food crisis for 2020, which was prepared just prior to the start of the pandemic in February this year. Africa will be disproportionately affected by these challenges. Amid the pandemic, There are also important questions to ask about the robustness and the sustainability of the African food system. Looking ahead, it's important and necessary to reflect on how African food systems need to change if the interconnected sustainable development goals that we have referred to related to the system are to be achieved. What would a transformed African food system look like? If we can get the next slide, we will see there that there's four important outcomes that need to be achieved if we want to transform the African food system. To provide access to adequate amounts of safe, nutritious food leading to improved food security and reduced malnutrition, addressing SDD Sustainable Development Goal 2 of Zero Hunger explicitly. This will make important contributions to public health, that is SDG 3, by reducing the burden of disease associated with malnutrition. It will have to be economically efficient, contributing directly to SDG 1 of poverty reduction, wealth creation, and reduced inequalities, addressing SDG 5 of gender inequalities, and SDG 10 on reduced inequalities. It would have to be environmentally sustainable, with climate-smart agriculture widely adopted, SDG 13 climate action. The food systems activities in a transformed system will also have to protect the biodiversity and the ecosystem services as necessary elements of a well-functioning system, addressing specifically SDG 14 and 15 of life below water and life on land. And then finally, it will be characterized by sustainable consumption, as was also outlined by Lindy, where specifically with the radical reductions in food losses across the entire value chain. To achieve these four interconnected outcomes, we need to deepen our understanding of the African food system and to develop evidence-based interventions to bring about the transformation which is required. What role can research play in the transformation of African food systems? The connected circularity of the food system, which has come through clearly in both the presentations, requires an interdisciplinary research approach that seeks transformative solutions to African challenges. Although similar in some ways to global systems, the African food system have activities and actors and conditions that are very uniquely African and can only be addressed by African knowledge produced by Africans, so that we make sure it's Africa-based and owned, but globally enabled. For example, the African food system consists of a multiple of interacting different African systems that include formal and informal supply chains, that include agricultural and forage-based food production systems, etc. Much research has focused on global food systems. However, relatively little attention has been paid to the specificities and the particularities of the African context. There are significant challenges in implementing large-scale research on complex food systems in Africa, which have really hindered its prevalence. One critical challenge has been a limited contextual and comprehensive conceptualization of the African food system and how it is similar to or different from other systems globally. Recently, the Food Systems Research Network for Africa was approved under auspices of the Aroa Center of Excellence, directed by Professor Sibanda, in partnership with the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom and Vanderpan. The University of Pretoria, as the lead for the Food Systems Research Network, will collaborate with 10 African universities representing 6 the different countries to develop a food systems approach over the next 2 to 3 years and to assist in training the next generation of food system thinkers to work collaboratively on the continent in an effort to address and provide evidence-based information for this transformed food system, cognizant of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Swanepoel. Our next speaker is Professor John Sharp. Professor John Sharp, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. My old friend Francis Nyamjo said this morning that it was a very good thing to be the last speaker in the session, and I agree with him because it gives me the opportunity to change the approach, the focus slightly from the people who spoke before me. I want to pose some questions which I think are important. Who decides what it is that we need to know about the challenges that face us in the world at the present time? Second question, what is their authority to be instructing us in the way that they do? And thirdly, what are the methods, what are the ways that they're using to communicate what they think we need to know to us? Now, I want to take a case study because that's all you can do to address a question like this. Some of you may well be aware that the World Bank, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, has just 2 months ago produced a report on the African Continental Free Trade Area. Some of you will know the African Continental Free Trade Area is a project which has been on the go for the last decade. It's been driven, championed by the African Union in conjunction with some of the international financial institutions such as the World Bank. And it has reached the point where it is now going to be implemented, this free trade area, which is going to span the continent of Africa. So, the World Bank report, which they've just issued, is a year after the implementation began in 2019. So what does the report do? Well, obviously it enters this continental free trade area. It says it's a very good idea. But I'm interested as well in the question of how they communicate this message to what information are they giving us which encourages us to come to the conclusion or to agree with the conclusion which they reach, which is that it is all a very good idea. They use complex modeling and simulation packages, so it's all based on computing and big data, to produce a number of what I would call killer facts about the benefits of a free trade area to Africa at this juncture. They go into great detail on this. The report is really that. It is the results of their modeling of the situation in Africa that they're communicating to us. So they talk about the benefits to the continent as a whole of a free trade area, and what's striking about this is the kind of precision they're simulating and modeling, but the answers they give are very precise. So they say, in fact, I'm not going to give you all the precise details because I don't think they're all that accurate necessarily. But they tell us that by 2035, the continent would gain an extra income of 470 odd billion if we implement a free trade area across the whole continent effectively. They look at different categories. So they're trying to tell you that if you're in a less developed country in Africa, the country will benefit by this much. It'll gain so much. If you're in a more developed part of the continent, on the other hand, you will gain so much. and they tell you also different categories of the population. It's what you certainly would want to hear, namely that the share of income per capita to women will increase over the period to 2035. If we implement the plan, the share to women will increase relative to the share to men. And of course, we all know the huge youth unemployment problem, and they say, well, the youth will benefit across the continent more than men will, and they attach figures to this, numbers. Okay. Now you've got some idea of what the report does, but what does the report not do? What does it not mention? What does it not tell us? For example, there's a very interesting piece of information that I acquired by looking at other sources of information about this whole thing. And it becomes clear that Nigeria and South Africa, the two biggest economies on the continent, refused to sign this document, the agreement, in 2018, and only signed it a year later in 2019. You might wonder, why are the two biggest economies in the continent holding out in this fashion? What did they see that was problematic? Well, it starts to become clear in the case of Nigeria. The Nigerian manufacturers, or an organization of Nigerian manufacturers, said, we don't think a free trade agreement or a free trade area, which includes us, would be a very good idea, because what will happen is that the tariffs behind which we are producing whatever it is we're producing will likely be lowered. In addition, they said, we find the rules of origin contained in the agreement. In other words, the rules of origin are rules which say where a particular product or good was manufactured. So they would say their objection was the rules were so vague that it would be possible for country A within Africa to import good from a country outside Africa, add value to that in a very minimal way, perhaps by repackaging it, and then selling it on to country B as a product of Africa. And they said, well, if that happens, we are going to go under, because we won't be able to withstand the pressure. Interestingly enough, the labor unions in the manufacturing industries concerned in Nigeria joined the manufacturers in objecting. And they had a very colorful description of this proposed free trade area. They said it is a radioactive neoliberal plot against Africa. So, what then is the World Bank trying to tell us by writing this ringing endorsement for the free trade area in Africa? It also, I must add, and this is the link to our overall topic, it brings the COVID crisis into this, into the equation when they write about how good this will be, because they say that the COVID crisis will cost Africa. I don't know how well, we can all, I suppose, dream up figures if we want, but they say the COVID crisis will cost $80 billion in Africa in 2020 alone. Now, obviously, nobody is denying that there's a great deal of money will be lost. It's the precision. It's the precision that they are, the 80 billion in this year, that one wonders, why are they doing this? Why not just say a lot of money? Why do you want to say 80 billion? So what are they doing here? I think, and here I'm referring to the title, which said, of my presentation, Don't Waste a Serious Crime, which interestingly, other people have referred to, but I'm referring to a source which initially used this phrase, which is quite commonly used. It initially used this phrase with quite considerable degree of irony. This is a book written by a historian of economics called Philip Mirowski in 2013. The book was called Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste. And it was an account, his book is an account of the way in which the neoliberals in the United States, in particular, but around the world as well, responded to the financial crisis. He's not referring to the COVID crisis, but to the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And I suggest there's some parallels between the cases he discusses and the one about the financial, about the FTA, the free trade area for Africa. Let me look at Murawski for a couple of minutes, because I think he touches on a number of topics which I think will come up again in our discussions. Murawski's starting point is the fact that Murawski's starting point is the fact of an American empire. That's what he calls it. He says it's an empire in all but name. Nobody calls it an empire, but that's what it is founded, he says, on mercantilism, on militarism, 750 military bases around the world, on intellectual property rights. They have decided that intellectual property is something you can own. It's property. And owning, and the fact is that they also, of course, own the world currency. It does nothing, says Murawski, to do with liberalism, neo or otherwise. It isn't neoliberalism, of course, is not a statement of what exists in the US or in the post-1970s world. It is an ideology that is intended to mask the truth of the existence of an American empire, which includes the fact that dominant markets are run in the interests of financial institutions for the last 40 years, banks and their shareholders. So in the case of the American, or the global financial crisis, which of course originated in the United States, it originated because the financial institutions had devised new ways of accumulating by getting poor people into debt and making them pay interest on the debt which they had undertaken. The subprime crisis is what, of course, I'm referring to. Very risky, of course. Now you're not producing anything. The people who control, who dominate the commanding heights of the economy are not necessarily producing anything. They're not manufacturers. They are financiers who basically make money by lending it and then charging interest. But if you lend to the poor, this of course becomes very risky. They had to invent ways of attempting to securitize the risk they were undertaking in all sorts of weird and wonderful new vehicles, financial vehicles, and these vehicles didn't work, as we know. So you had the 2007-2008 crisis, which was followed by the Queen of England, and many others asking the question why the neoliberal economists had not foreseen this crisis. Now, Murawski's argument is that any truthful answer to this question would have revealed the truth about the interests the system commanded by financial interests actually serves. So the neoliberals devised an answer about markets and how markets can always be relied on to solve all problems in both the economy and the society at large. The market can resolve all problems. And one of the examples he gives, which is very interesting, I think we're going to touch on it again tomorrow, is the crisis, which is a long-standing one, longer standing than the financial crisis of 2008, is the problem of global warming. The solution which the neoliberals devised and punted for global warming is, of course, as we know, to introduce a market in global emissions trading. This does not, of course, global emissions trading does not, of course, address the root causes of global warming at all. but it does make a lot of money for the people who are involved in trading global emissions, who issue these and trade them. Okay. Obviously, in that case, in the longer run, I might add in addition to that point, of course, in the longer run, they are thinking, in the case of global warming, about bioengineering as a solution beyond. I mean, I don't think anybody really supposes that selling carbon is going to solve the problem in totality. So the next phase of this kind of solution put forward by the neoliberals is geoengineering. Why not seed the atmosphere with reflective material that reflects some of the sun's rays back, which again does not, it treats the symptoms rather than the causes of the problem. At the same time, of course, as it makes a great deal of money for those who are involved in developing all this stuff. Okay. So the case that carbon emissions trading brings benefits to all may be hard to make unless one introduces so much confusion that people look for the easy way out. And of course, that was done in the case of carbon emissions trading, and indeed the financial crisis. Of course, the one we're facing now, the COVID crisis, we know that President Trump has punted the line that science talks nonsense on this. So, and he's just spread confusion for ever since the pandemic started. We know as well with the financial and the global warming problem. Again, challenging science. So people were in fact paid by the big corporations, particular scientists, particular people who claimed skill in science were hired to say there was no such thing as global warming. Were paid even before that to say there was no danger in smoking cigarettes, and so on and so forth. So we need to be not to be naive. I think that's the point, one of the points that Morovsky's trying to make, and that I'm certainly trying to make as well. We must put ourselves in a position where we're able to ask those hard questions. Who's telling us what? What are they saying? How are they saying it? And why are they saying it? Okay. In the case of the financial crisis, people looked for the easy way out, and that turned out to be people eventually settled for the argument that the federal government should buy up the toxic assets which the banks had been stranded with once their collateral debt obligations and all those other means they had tried to develop to securitize the risk of making subprime loans. Once they had all blown up, the recommendation became, well, the government should buy up the toxic assets. So the taxpayer effectively paid, and the banks walked away with a subsidy. Okay. In this by the World Bank on the food, on the free trade area in Africa. There's the same kind of confusion in this report. There's a lot of white noise that nobody, these I mentioned to you, they're very figures. So much will be lost to COVID, $80 billion, but we'll gain 489 billion. Why not 490 billion or 500 billion or 400 billion? We'll gain that if we implement this free trade agreement, and so on and so. So who's going to run the risk? The question should be, so it appears that everybody's going to benefit, But the way in which these figures have been derived is totally incomprehensible to anybody except the experts who wrote the report, because they're using these arcane means of assessing, predicting, modeling the future, which, at the end of the day, what the World Bank is saying to us is, look, our experts have looked at the effects of all of this, and we are telling you that everybody, if you put this free trade area into practice properly, everybody's going to win. Okay. But who's going to win under a free trade area? This is a serious question. It's the question that the Nigerians, the manufacturers and the workers raised. Doesn't mean to say you've got to junk the whole thing, but it does mean we need to address it. If you lift restrictions on trade, some people will benefit and some people will, and not others. Some people will lose. By the same token, if you lift restrictions on trade in one area or zone, a free trade zone, that means that people outside the zone must, or countries outside the zone, economies, whatever, outside the zone must face restrictions. This stands to reason. I mean, it's logical. And the long history of tariffs and subsidies and other restrictions and encouragements to trade shows this to be the case. To take a couple of examples, Britain sheltered its farmers behind the Corn Laws for the first half of the 19th century. At the height of Britain's imperial power in the second half of the 19th century, it forbade its colonies to challenge its prowess at manufacturing in any form whatsoever. Simply would not allow them to manufacture the same stuff in case it was competition. The United States became the leading power of the 20th century behind a wall of tariffs. These are they are political decisions, they are interested decisions that are being made. They are not simply technical decisions. The politics counts. And you can't make generalizations. A free trade area is good for everybody. Tell us who is going to benefit and who's going to lose, and then we can take an informed decision. But the World Bank report contains none of this, nothing, no reference to history, no reference to the issues that I've been raising, beyond the statement that unrestricted trade is an axiomatic good. Why are they doing this? They're hints in the report, I think. They actually go to the trouble, which I would have thought, how you do this, I haven't a clue, but they went to the trouble of quantifying the benefits of a free trade area in Africa to economies and people and countries outside Africa, and they put a figure on it. Are they playing the same game? When they do this, are they playing the same game as the one discussed by Mirovsky? Hiding some unpalatable truths behind a story which is, it's like, just so story. But there's a warning here for us. We need those of us who say the people on the ground deserve to understand what is happening. Do not just give them some nonsense for them to believe. There's a challenge also for more progressive scholars who are trying to defend the interests of the people on the ground. We must not be sucked into the neoliberal game. They say free trade is good by definition. We should not say that it is bad by definition. That's the whole point of looking at the history of trade restrictions in the past, for example. We need to know who will benefit from specific interventions and who will not. For example, we need to get out there. We need to look at this question in different parts of Africa. What about the Nigerians who objected to the signing of the treaty in 2018 and were able to delay Nigeria's signing until 2019? Have they in fact been satisfied by a clarification in the definition of these rules of origin for particular products? Or have they been told to shut up and keep quiet and not to rock the boat? If we can't answer these questions, if we're just going to believe whatever we're told by the people who, or the organizations that dominate the world financial scene, if we can't answer those kinds of questions about different categories of people throughout the continent and their interests, then we are indeed, as Murawski said, letting a serious crisis go to waste. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor John Sharp, for unpacking what I would think is a rather complex political economic space. But thank you so much for your insights and unpacking such a complex terrain. Now, Professor John Sharp was our last speaker of the day, which means that our discussion room is now open, and I'm going to get the ball rolling by asking, I have two questions with me here, and I'm going to ask them in turn. The first question that I have, I would direct it to Professor Frans Swanepoel and Professor Lindiwe Sibanda. The question is, now food system transformation to end hunger and malnutrition is a growing mantra in numerous food talks. Another growing voice is around reimagining our approach to food systems to achieve SDG 2, which is to end hunger. And in all these discussions, the idea of partnerships is buzzing, it stands out. Do you see the COVID era, its effects, or perhaps just the context, harnessing or disconnecting such partnerships? What is the situation like at national, regional, and global scale? I will start with Professor Sibanda, and then Professor Swanepoel, you can also add your thoughts to that.
Thank you very much for that question. So starting point is partnerships. What are we learning from COVID-19? Secondly, what are the food systems or the transformation of this food system? What are we reimagining? And what partnerships do we need? I want to believe that the starting point is that COVID-19 has taught us that human lives matter. One death is one too many, but it has also taught us that there is science that informs evidence for decision making. The number of eyes that are glued onto our TVs as we receive Minister Kiz's report every day in the last couple of months has taught people that science can be demystified into a language that we can translate into action. Secondly, it has taught us that our ministers, our policymakers, can speak outside Parliament to a wide range of constituencies and explain the impact of a pandemic. Third, it has taught us that they did not come to speak alone. They rallied other constituencies We saw the Minister of Social Protection, Ministers of Agriculture, Ministers of Finance, all the other sectors coming in to speak about a pandemic. So it was health, it was food production, it was the economy, it was social protection. It was the Minister of Education worrying about when will schools open, the Minister of Higher Education, our Vice Chancellors holding many webinars, sharing experiences. So if we question food systems transformation, what will it take? This is an opportunity from lessons learned from COVID that one, a human health crisis is a food crisis. Two, that the same partnerships we rallied for COVID-19 would be the relevant partnerships to take us forward in reimagining the food systems that we want. I did unpack in my presentation that in the food systems approach, we are looking from farm to the dining table to the body that we produce. We are looking at a healthy food, healthy planet, healthy body. Now, those three nexuses all require various partnerships. So, the cake I presented depicting the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, right at the center, the string that tied the 16, making them 17, was SDG number 17 on partnerships. So, in short, to answer that question, COVID has taught us that health, food, nutrition, the economy are all intertwined. Can we demystify the issue of agriculture being a science that stands alone? Can we open up and break the barriers and the silos and weave in the partnerships, multi-stakeholder platforms that will dialogue, undertake research to generate evidence, and use this evidence to inform policies that are robust, people-owned, and easy to implement. But most important, can we bring those that are most affected by the problem round the table to tell us what are they going through, what are the solutions that they foresee, the indigenous knowledge, intertwine it with science, intertwine it with the finance sector, with the policymakers, but bring in everybody to create those institutions that are knowledge-based, but also implementing the knowledge. So yes, we can end hunger, SDG 2 on zero hunger, really about SDG 17, bringing the right partnerships for the sustainable food systems that we are reimagining. And Africa can do it just like the whole world can do it. Thank you.
Professor Swanepoel, would like to add your thoughts?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I agree 100% with what Professor Sibanda has just said. Yes, definitely we can do it, and partnerships are critical to achieve that. We should focus on high-value strategic partnerships, obviously over and above for the context or the importance of the ones that Professor Sibanda outlined. From a university perspective also, we need to think carefully. We as a university want to position ourselves as a leading university on the African continent to become globally recognized for food systems transformation and to attract students from all around the globe, but especially from the continent, to work with us. We need to focus on our transdisciplinary research platforms at the University of Pretoria. We have 4 here. The one is the Future Africa Campus, where some of you are situated this afternoon, the Javits Art Center, Engineering 4, and Innovation Africa at UP. And those platforms put us in a position to really attract the best scholars and to develop solutions and innovations which are aligned with the Pan-African agenda for food systems transformation. So I think a distinctive approach towards Pan-Africanism in terms of our food systems transformation, Africa-based and owned but globally enabled, is what we can achieve through partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Swanepoel, for your thoughts and reactions on that. I was going to ask the second question, but I think it has been adequately responded to already in the responses that you gave. So I'm going to now move on to the questions that we're getting from the chat box. And the first question that we have is from Professor Robin Crew. Here, Professor Robin Crew says, since the World Health Organization now says that it never recommended lockdowns after the initial short period, why should universities consider further lockdowns when students are not a high-risk group? I'm going to give this question to Professor Moja.
For that question, and I think it's a relevant question to ask as to why universities should consider another lockdown or so. What I've seen happening in the US is that the lockdowns have been more temporary, not as harsh, being more like 2 weeks or so at a time, and not as long and as disruptive as in the past or so. So in this case, I think with situations where students are not necessarily the carriers of the virus or to infect one another or so, it doesn't make sense to actually lock down. But at the same time, I'm a proponent of locking down if there is evidence that the virus is spreading within the institution. My concern and my worry at the moment would be how well equipped our institutions are to really contain the infection within institutions. And I'll give you an example. With the reopening of institutions at the university where I am, they put in place protocols that included, as an example, first, everybody getting a test that's negative to be allowed to come back on campus, then continuing with bi-weekly tests, which is a very expensive endeavor to really keep an institution open. So I'm not sure what our institutions in South Africa are capable of doing to contain infections if they happen. For now, yes, I agree. World Health Organization has stated that there's no evidence that there's transmission there. But how do we tell in the future if there is a transmission within our institutions, and how do we deal with it? Is it not better to be preemptive rather than reactive by putting the right protocol measures in place in terms of how students behave or where they could be, and crowding, overcrowding, and all those measures that are needed to be put in place so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where we have to lock down institutions once more. So that would be my view. If we have a way of monitoring and being sure that we can contain the virus, there's no spreading within the institutions, then that should be fine.
Thank you so much, Professor Moji, for your reactions on that. Our next question comes from Professor Peter Fell. He says, what should teach in economics courses to encounter this? Who should teach? Who should we teach? Okay, what should we teach? All right. So he says, I'll take that again. What should we teach in economics courses to counter this misrepresentation of truth and intent? I think I'm going to give that to Professor Moja again, and Professor Sharp as well.
Yeah, I feel I'm not competent to really answer that question, since I don't know much about what's in the economics syllabi in terms of that. So I'll pass that question.
That's okay. That's fine. Let me redirect the question to Professor Sharp.
Well, I'm not sure. Yes, thank you for that question. I'm not sure that It is an issue of replacing one thing and substituting some other body of inquiry for it. But I think that there may be good cases for adding. It has, we have to face the fact that the economics, like social anthropology, those disciplines, even where people try and avoid it, disciplines have a political side to them, in the sense that they are addressing people who are differently positioned with regard to power and who have different interests. And if they don't take that into account at all, then the supposition is that they're possibly trying to hide the fact of where their allegiances lie. So, I mean, in a sense, all you can say about the sort of neoliberal form of economics, Andrew, you have to remember that the neoliberal economists, you have to distinguish between neoliberal and neoclassical economists. The neoliberal economists are a smaller category within the neoclassical economists. Mirovsky in his book makes a great deal of that point in the United States. There are many varieties of neoclassical economists. There are even economists who depart from orthodoxy, the unorthodox economists. And maybe it is simply a question. Nobody's saying, this is not 1984. Not saying you've got to learn this and not that. But there should be a sort of exposure of students to the range of views, and I suspect it's very difficult to generalize about this, but there are many cases where this is not done, and students are told this is the received truth. The sort of neoliberal version is the received truth. This is orthodoxy. Get on with it. And all one can say is we know there are lots of economists. I mean, there are a great many economists in total in the world, but there are lots of them who question the orthodoxy that is dominant at the moment, and they should simply be allowed, and they do. They have their own publication and so on, which I have in fact published something in. They have their own publication so it's more of that. It's exposing students to a range of opinions rather than simply one, no matter how dominant that view may be, because the dominance is not going to last forever. If you look at the history of the neoliberal economists, it goes all the way back to the 1930s, and they spent 40 years being totally ignored. Milton Friedman was one of them. He wasn't listened to and taken seriously until the 1970s, when the politics of the global situation, the politics of the changes in the economies of the Western countries in particular, allowed people like him to begin to come to the fore. So one needs to bear that in mind. They may be dominant at the moment within that discipline. That will not last forever. So it just makes sense to expose students to a range of different views. Political economy, you mentioned it yourself, Tafadzwa. I mean, that is in a sense the sort of left-leaning version of the broader discipline, and that too should be taught. It tends to have sort of places in economic history rather than in economics, the study of the present. It studies the past rather than the present. All one can say is that, again, valuable for students to be exposed to as wide a range of approaches and theoretical positions as possible. And I do believe it is, otherwise you do get this danger, think about, which is that we don't have the power when organizations like the World Bank, this is not the only report of this kind it has ever done, it works in fashion. So it goes through topics which became structural adjustment in the 1980s. They've dropped that now. And then they've been through more and more. This one is a sort of sideline. It's only Africa after all. So you don't have to be very explicit about what you're saying. Just give them some facts and let them get facts, which, as we call them, facts, and let them get on with this. One needs to have the ability to question, not simply or question it, and not simply accept it as received wisdom. Which is not to say they're always wrong. That's not the point that one is making. But one cannot assume that they're always right.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Sharp, for your reactions. We are just about closing today's session, but before we go, we have just one more question from Professor Ogude, and then after that, I will be requesting our speakers to have maybe just 3 seconds of the final words that they want to leave us with before we eventually close the session.
A very short, 1 or 2 short questions. One is directed to Professor Moja. Professor Moja, you talked about the effective use of blended learning, and you talked about the challenge of technology, that South Africa is not ready technologically. But I also want to argue that one of the problems, one of the challenges that also faces us is also embedded inequalities, that even if we had to encourage blended learning, the truth of the matter is that the majority of our people, one, do not have access to the technology itself. Secondly, given the problems that we've encountered in relation, for example, to energy, constant disruptions, sometimes which go on for hours and hours, is it really feasible in our context to encourage blended learning, even if it has its benefits? And the last question goes to Professor Sibanda and Professor Swanepoel. I'm always skeptical about pegging our analysis around policy goals, the SDGs, for example. And SDGs have become like a mantra, And I wonder whether we approach these SDGs critically to question the veracity or the usefulness and their relevance in our context. I would want you just to comment on that. Yeah.
Professor Moya would like to react to Professor Goode's question.
Thank you very much. Professor Gude, you are raising very, very important issues that our society faces, the inequities that we have. And that is why in the earlier comments that I made, I said that the pandemic has blown the lid open once more, that we have to revisit the challenges we face. So yes, we are not technologically ready, but we have to. We live in the century where everything is so digitized. So the reason that we're not ready is that our government hasn't taken the challenge very seriously. And we need to advocate for that. We need to push them to make sure that we get digitally ready. It is ironic that a country like South Africa, with its growing economy and being one of the biggest economies in Africa, as was mentioned earlier on, is the one that's struggling with being digitally ready. We have the resources, we are able to do that, we just lack political will to do it. When I travel throughout the continent and get to some remote places in the continent, people's access of digital technology is much better than what we have in the country, in South Africa per se. So I think we have to work hand in hand with the tech companies, with government, to show them the importance of really getting us ready for this century or so. So that's my comment regarding how ready we are and how we're not really ready. We are involved in high-tech experiments with the experiment in Northern Cape and so on. But at the same time, we're not ready to make digital technology accessible to a village a few miles away from the capital or so. So that's what I would say. We should push for that. We should push for partnerships. We should push for privatization of some of these deliveries also for the delivering of digital technology. When it comes to blended learning, we already have it in pockets of it. We don't have it in all institutions. And where we have it, that's where we have to take lessons from that and make sure that we are actually using it effectively. Make sure that there is effective use, there is effective teaching and learning, and not just take it for granted that we just migrate what we do face-to-face in class onto the online platforms. We know that that's not the case. So for institutions that are doing it, that are committed to doing it, we need to now focus on the pedagogical approaches that are different online compared to the ones that we use when we're teaching face-to-face. So these are issues that we need to be really looking into addressing and getting ourselves ready for another crisis that we don't know where it will be coming from, when it's coming or so, but we should be able to get ourselves ready to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Moja. Can I also then invite Professor Lindiwe Sibanda to react to Professor Ogude's question, and perhaps to just also tie that with your closing remarks, because we are now really pressed for time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Ogude, if you had challenged me 5-6 years ago as we were heading towards the Millennium Development Goals of 2015, I would have joined your party and said, yes, it is dangerous to pit policy actions and goals towards these mega global goals. But on sustainable development goals, I beg to differ. Why I differ is that the fundamentals of SDGs are about leaving no one behind. When we did the Millennium Development Goals, to help the underdeveloped, the least developed countries to catch up. But we were catching up with the bad, as we have seen. We were going to be emitting more greenhouse gases in a bid to be better developed. But under Sustainable Development Goals, one, we are leaving no one behind, and particularly in the sector where I see it on food, all 19 of them relate to food. What that means is that we are going to address poverty, which is a must do for every. So it's all about what we do at local level in order to link with the global conversation. I'll give you a quick example of one of the initiatives I'm involved with. This is the UN's Sustainable Development Goals Champions for SDG 12.3, where we want to reduce food loss and waste by 50% by year 30. What are we doing? We're a coalition of researchers, private sector, government, policymakers, and ordinary citizens, CEOs of big companies, where we are saying, can we put targets at local level of where we want to reduce food loss and waste. My target is at the farm gate. Currently, we are losing 40% of the food that's produced because of the poor cold chain. Secondly, put a target. Secondly, measure, then act. And that action cannot be done by me alone, cannot be done by farmers. It needs partnerships. Can we conscientize our governments? Can we bring in the technology people to avail technologies for reducing post-harvest losses? Can we bring policymakers to make those imports, the steel, the fabrications we need to put together machinery that reduce the losses? But can we also bring the markets closer to the farm gate so that we can also value aid and process? So for me, sustainable development goals are an impetus that helps us to learn from others as we share globally, but localize the solutions for problems that we would have had to solve anyway with or without the sustainable development goals. But is that we are no longer talking about just SDGs for human sustenance, but the planet, people, and the food we produce. So on that one, it's close to my heart, and I believe it's the right thing to take our aspirations towards the global goals, but to act locally. I hope I've convinced you on that one. I'll bring you more when I visit you in your office. Coming to my closing remarks, I started off by saying a human crisis is a food crisis. It's been said many times in this webinar that every crisis should be an opportunity to reverse the bad. And I think we have a golden opportunity for addressing the fundamental wrongs in our food system and for achieving the food system transformation roadmap, but also getting to our target if we ride on this pandemic and the lessons we've learned and the new way of doing business, where we cut silos, embrace partnerships, and share experiences. Digitalization will expedite our learning. Let's embrace it and leave behind. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Professor Swanepoel, what are your reactions to Professor Ogude's question and your closing remarks? Unfortunately, we cannot get any sound from Professor Swanepoel, so we will switch over to Professor John Sharp, and then we'll get back. And then we'll get back to Professor Swanepoel for the closing remarks. So, Professor John Sharp, can you please give us your closing remarks?
Okay. Perhaps you could just nod or something if you can hear me so that I know I'm not talking. Okay. I mean, my comment would be I don't know a lot, of course, about food systems transformation. But let me try and be provocative, but not, I hope, uncollegial. As I see it, the discussion about this today, at any rate, has been very much along technical lines. 40% of the food that leaves the farm doesn't reach the supermarkets, etc., etc. So what can we do to improve the cold system so it doesn't rot on the way? And that's important, no question. But so also is the fact, which we cannot deny, that increasing amounts of land in Africa are being bought up or leased to bought up by or leased to foreign corporates who intend to either grow food on a large scale, most often for export to their countries of origin, or to grow biofuels. Maybe that's going a bit out of fashion at the moment, but it's been a big issue. Lots of land has been, the people who were on that land get displaced. So that's one question. Another question, another thing that is happening in Africa is one of my colleagues in the Human Economy Program has done a wonderful study in Dar es Salaam in which he shows that a city of 5 million people is fed, and as it's grown, the food available to it has increased to keep pace. But it has no supermarkets, no supply chains, no cold storage chains at all. Whereas here, we have a limited number of farmers, all of one racial classification, or most of them, farming very large agribusinesses and supplying expensive food. The point about Dar es Salaam's food is cheap. If one wants to, this is my question. I don't know the answer, but I would love to know. If one is going to discuss food systems transformation, surely one has to address these questions as well as the technical ones, important though the technical questions are.
Thank you for that, Professor Sharp. Professor Boja, we had not asked you to, given you an opportunity rather to give your closing remarks. Would you like to leave us with a few words from your end?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this has been a very informative session. I've learned a lot from my colleagues coming from different sectors, different from me in education or so. And my parting shot would be more of what I kept hearing right across all speakers: partnerships, collaborations as being very, very important. And I would like to take that back into the education sector, that our system of higher education still lacks a lot of collaboration or partnership within the country, as well as partnerships within the continent. I recall looking at one of the reports, Web of Science reports, indicating where our scholars publish, that our scholars were publishing outside the continent, and that there was very little collaboration or co-production of knowledge amongst scholars within the continent. So I want to underscore the need for collaborations and partnerships within the country as well as within the continent. The second point that I want to mention as I close, I am aware and I note the fact that our system has transformed since 1994. But when I look at what still needs to be done, I find that it is the same agenda that we had in 1994 when we talked about transforming higher education: access, affordability, transformation of systems for making them much more inclusive and all. So we are making progress, but we're making very slow progress towards really enhancing the higher education sector. And we know that higher education is crucial for development. We are listed as underachieving in higher education achievements. We are not producing people that get jobs afterwards or so. So it begs a bigger question for me: what are we transforming and what are we transforming it for? And what is actually in the way of transformation? So the pandemic has really brought those issues back to us to say we really need to look at our system and make much more progress, jump much further than what we have done so far. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Professor Boja. Professor Swanepoel is back. Professor Swanepoel, would you like to react to Professor Ogudi's question, and also perhaps just tie that with your last few words?
Thank you very much. Can you just indicate, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you, because it seemed that I went offline. To respond to Professor Ogudi and bring it into the context of Professor Sibanda will be quite a long conversation, which I look forward to have with the two of them, maybe offline or in another room. For today, I would really like to make use of the opportunity to thank Professor Ogudi and all the participants. This emphasizes, I think, and really show the importance of transdisciplinary approaches. The Center for Advancement of Scholarship is really focused on addressing problems and issues in a inter and transdisciplinary fashion. This is where Professor Sibanda, John Sharp, myself, Professor Tabor are all hosted, and that Professor Ugudi with the Center provides us this opportunity to think in an integrated manner. Technical is important on the one hand, like Professor Sharp mentioned. For example, maybe my and Professor Sibanda's presentations could contain a lot of technical information, but at the same time, it's so important for us to realize and understand that we need to understand the socioeconomic complexities and the potential input or contribution towards formation, to make sure that the knowledge that we generate and the knowledge that we produce makes a contribution towards improved quality of life. The COVID pandemic have underlined again the importance for multi, inter and transdisciplinary approaches to try and move forward or make a contribution towards this knowledge. That's the final comments from me, and again to everybody, thank you very much for a most interesting seminar this afternoon.
Thank you, Professor Swanepoel, for that, for your closing remarks. And that brings us to the end of today's session. I would like to thank our speakers today for your insightful thoughts and reflections on the social impact of COVID-19 pandemic. I would also want to thank the participants who have been asking a lot of questions in our chat box. Unfortunately, because of time, we could not respond to all the questions, but we have taken note of all the questions, and perhaps we will in the future engage with the questions. So we will go for now, and but we will hope that the discussions continue in our various places. And let's not forget that the symposium is still going on. We have another session tomorrow in the morning at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. I'm told it's 10 o'clock. So please do not miss the final session of the symposium on the scientific and social impact of COVID-19. Thank you again to all of you for joining us this afternoon. And I wish you a good evening and good morning, good afternoon, depending on wherever you are. Thank you so much.